Hello and welcome to our weekly look inside Syria. I'm Mike Hanna. On Wednesday, Syria's president said his forces have no option but to win the war or to lose the country. Speaking in an interview on local TV last week, Bashar al-Assad maintained that thousands of foreign fighters had crossed over from Jordan and warned that the conflict was increasingly becoming a regional one. And he repeated the allegation that Western powers are directly and indirectly supporting elements of al-Qaeda in their desire to unseat him.
I think that Syria, in these circumstances, is exposed to an attempted colonization by all means. There's an attempt to invade Syria by foreign forces. These forces are using new techniques. It's an attempt to invade Syria culturally.
Well, this week we focus on the possibility of a permanent or even temporary partition of Syria and whether this would lead to a drop in the level of the conflict. Last week, the Syrian president extended yet another amnesty to all those who'd laid down their arms. But within hours of the offer, several reports indicated a massive mobilization of government forces and a series of offensives in specific areas of the country. The possible consequence, whether intended or not, the creation of defined enclaves in which opposition forces are contained. On April the 5th, in an interview with the Turkish TV station Ulusal, President Assad admitted that partition could be a possibility, but he warned of the consequences. He said, "Everyone knows that if the things reach the point of partition or if the terrorists gain control in Syria or both, the situation will directly spread to neighboring countries, and the domino effect may eventually reach distant countries. This means that there will be a state of instability for years." Well, to discuss all of this, we're joined by our three guests. In Washington, D.C., Andrew Tabler, a senior fellow in the program on Arab politics at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. In Paris, Ziad Majed, assistant professor of Middle East Studies at the American University of Paris and coordinator of the Arab Network for the Study of Democracy. And in Ottawa, Mahdi Darius Nazemroaya, a Canadian-based sociologist. Mr. Nazemroaya is also a research associate at the Centre for Research on Globalisation in Montreal, specialising in geopolitical and strategic issues. Welcome to you all. Let's begin with Andrew Tabler. To what degree is a forced and perhaps a temporary partition already in place?
I think that, based on my visits to Syrian border regions or areas inside of Syria, you can already see the country generally being divided off into spheres of influence or parts in a de facto sense. In the northeast, you have an area dominated by a number of Kurdish groups. In the center of the country, it's mixed between the opposition, many of whom, or the majority of whom, are Sunni. And then as you get towards the coast, and then, Lebanon and Damascus, you have the area which is dominated by the regime and where the regime's forces are strongest. In all of those areas, you have to go through different parties in order to gain access to Syrians or to Syrian areas in many cases. And given that I don't see any kind of dramatic shift in U.S. policy or any kind of direct intervention, absent some kind of major change or the use of chemical weapons, I think that this kind of conflict will grind on, and therefore we'll have a Syria that's in a de facto sense divided into parts, but in a de jure sense might still exist.
Well, Ziad Majed, your opinion on this. Do we have a de facto partition in existence at present?
Well, I think it depends on how we will define division. Today, the regime tries to control Damascus, Homs, and the coast, which means that in Damascus, it will try to say that it's still illegitimate, that it's still in power. Homs is geostrategically extremely important because it will connect the capital to the coast. And then, of course, you have the coast where the regime considers that there is a kind of confessional basis supporting it. At the same time, this is not a viable situation. All will depend on how things will develop later. Now we have areas where chaos is reigning. In others, the opposition controls the ground but cannot always protect itself and the population against air raids and Scud missiles. So the situation is still unclear now. The time will determine to which direction we'll be heading. But I think that the regime has a plan B, that is to try to defend Homs and the coast if Damascus is to fall in the hands of the opposition. We're not yet there. And if we consider that Homs is a key point, as I was saying, then this also might explain why Hezbollah is intervening from the Baalbek al-Hermel area that is very close to this, to Homs and the villages around it, in order to support what might be considered as well as a confessional cleansing leading to a control of Homs and most villages around it to connect the capital to the coast. But as I said, this is temporary. All will depend on how things will evolve.
We'll get to plans B and possibly C and D in a moment, but I want to go to Mahdi Nazemroaya with that specific issue. Are we looking at a de facto division, semi-partition on the ground in the current conflict?
There's an objective to create de facto Balkanization in Syria. There's an external objective to divide this country. Their neighbors, the Israelis, would benefit off this, and it would be disastrous for the entire region. Now, another important question is who's going to control these areas, these divided areas. When we speak about a Sunni region or an Alawite coast or a Kurdish area, we have to look at where these ideas are coming from, what's pushing this process ahead in Syria.
Well, let's go to Ziad Majed with that. What do you think is pushing the process in addition to that ongoing conflict, obviously, which is the determinant?
Well, what is pushing and creating this whole situation is a despotic regime that has been in place for 43 years and that is refusing to leave, to abandon power, to share power. It's a regime that did not hesitate from day one of the revolution, when things were still very peaceful, to open fire, to massacre people. And the result today is a conflict. Definitely there are foreign interests. Definitely there are lots of complexities that are now being added to the Syrian situation, but this should not let us forget that there is a regime in place since 1970 that is a despotic one by all means, by all definitions. We can see and show how violent and brutal it is, and there is a people determined to change the situation. Now, definitely there are lots of risks when it comes to militarization and when it comes to the ongoing situation today. Israel might be an actor. Turkey is watching with lots of interest and lots of fear from the Kurdish question. Lebanon is a fragile neighbor. Iraq has its own problem. Jordan is weak. So most neighbors of Syria, except for Israel, also fear the consequences. However, what is problematic is that the international community has been extremely hesitant and it's leaving the Syrian people to time that is becoming more and more decisive in its dramatic consequences. And Russia and Iran are playing as well their influence and their interests in Syria, which is making the regime determined to defend itself and to destroy the country.
Well, let's just go to Andrew Tabler, if I could just interrupt you at that particular point. But let's just go to Andrew Tabler and ask that question. Is it in anybody's interest to have a de jure legal partition?
No, I don't think so. I met with officials in every country, with the exception of Iraq. They adamantly do not want a partition of the country. And I think there's a difference here between politically, people might want one thing. They might want a sphere of influence. And I think all the neighboring countries have a sphere of influence inside of Syria, including some regional countries, such as Iran backing up the regime, Qatar and Saudi Arabia backing up large swaths of the opposition. But I think the big problem is that Syria is home to the largest stockpile of chemical weapons in the Middle East. And with that and the breakdown of the state and the potential transfer of those weapons, either outside of the country or to other groups inside of Syria, that has a lot of risks. And I think there's been a marked shift in thinking. And particularly, I think the Jordanians and the Israelis are very worried about that as they see developments in the area south of Damascus and the fighting kicking off there. So I don't think in a de jure sense anybody wants the breakup of Syria, but in a de facto sense, I think it's happening. I think regional countries are backing up that fight. They're backing up their different proxies, and that's not good news for Syria as we know it.
Well, Mahdi Nazemroaya, I want you to pick up one specific issue there. We've heard from Andrew Tabler twice now, the issue of chemical weapons as a determinant of what may happen within that conflict. Some would argue that, yes, that is a truly important factor being watched by the US and Israel in particular. Yet others would argue that it's a red herring, taking attention away from what is really happening on the ground and diverting attention from the complexities of the shifting power struggles within Syria itself. Your view on this?
I do believe it's a red herring. I think it's a pretext. I don't think that the government of Syria would use chemical weapons against its own citizens. I do think they would use chemical weapons against an external invasion by NATO or the United States, but I don't think they would use it against their own civilians. In fact, it's the opposition militias that worry me the most about getting their hands on chemical weapons. Everyone is worried, let's be clear and frank about this, everyone is worried about certain militias within the anti-government forces of getting their hands on the chemical weapons. They've already released videos on YouTube where they've killed animals. It's them that's the threat in regards to using chemical weapons. But I do want to get back to the question of partitioning Syria. I agree with Andrew that de facto Balkanization divisions are taking place, or at least that's the objective. De jure is legal Balkanization is a different question, but we can look at neighboring Iraq. Iraq has been it's been Balkanized, soft Balkanization. The Kurds in the north, in the Kurdistan regional government, the autonomous area there, are virtually independent. They have their own flag, they issued their own passports, and this could play out in Syria. And Israel does have an interest in doing this. If you look at Israeli policy documents that involve people that were part of the last administration in the United States, such as the Clean Break, they clearly talk about dividing Syria, and they use this Orientalist discourse about Sunnis versus Shiites versus Kurds, and there is an interest to divide the country. In fact, when the Syrian National Coalition or the Syrian National Council before it talked about a northern enclave being protected by a no-fly zone by NATO, that is Balkanization, that is division, and partition is a goal in that sense.
Well, we will continue to discuss these issues, but let's just pause for a moment. Syria is and always has been a largely multi-ethnic nation. Last week, Syrians from all ethnic groups met in Istanbul. They're trying to set up a body to bridge the deep divisions among them and to prevent even greater sectarian unrest if Assad's government falls. There are several ethnic and religious groups in Syria. Sunni Arabs comprise 74% of Syria's total population, while Sunni Kurds make up 10%. Alawites, the Shia Muslim sect from which the Assad family hails, comprise roughly 13% of Syria's 22 million population. 10% of the population is Christian and 3% is Druze. But it's important that these figures may have shifted given the huge exodus of refugees into neighboring countries, and also, very importantly, giving the swelling numbers of foreign fighters who are coming in. Let's go to Ziad Majed on this particular issue. To what extent has this influx of outsiders compounded what was always a tinderbox in many ways within Syria itself?
Well, first, I think that the divisions in Syria are not only based on confessional or ethnic lines. There are lots of other divisions related to regional questions, related to rural versus urban, social classes. So it's not only an ethnic or confessional configuration. And we can see that whether in the opposition or to some extent around the regime, there are different groups, even if no one can deny that there is a majority of Sunni on one side and the Alawite majority on the other. Now, when it comes to the external actors or to those Islamists or jihadists who are coming to Syria, I think in numbers they are very small. They might become in 1 year much more present on the ground, but so far there are few thousands out of more than 140,000 fighters in the opposition, and I'm not sure that they are much more than the Hezbollah, the Iranian and the Russian experts and members who are fighting with the regime. So definitely there are elements of external intervention already there. but still we are in a configuration where a majority of the people wants to get rid of a regime that is responsible of most of the crimes committed. And just one brief comment on the chemical weapon. I'm not sure that a regime that uses airplanes, Scud missiles, gas in some cases, really worry about its own people when it comes to using that weapon. Maybe they're not using it just because they fear what could be an international intervention in that case, or an international reaction, even if some of the signs from Washington or other capitals are not even that alarming when it comes to possible scenarios of minor use of chemical weapons.
Mahdi Nazemroaya, I want to pick up on one particular thing that Ziad mentioned there. That it is too simple to look at the divisions within Syria on that ethnic or confessional basis. He mentioned there that important split between rural and a town, for example. These are factors which are not always taken into account when looking at the complexities and the shifts in terms of power. How important is it to recognize this type of detail, that specific, for example, the difference between the rural and the urban in terms of attempting to reach some kind of end to this ongoing conflict?
Well, I agree with Ziad about the differences between rural and urban areas. I find that in the urban areas, the cities where there's affluent middle classes, that you find more Assadi supporters, more loyalists, as you would call them. It's in the countryside where you would find people that are more prone to support the opposition. But I disagree with Ziad on the point that the country's politically divided, with Alawites on one side and Sunnis on the other. The majority of this government support, let's be clear, comes from Sunnis. Most of the military is Sunnis. Most of the members of the government are Sunnis. I don't agree with the typecasting of this government as an Alawite regime. It's multi-confessional and it's multi-ethnic. The defense minister and the prime minister that were killed were Greek Orthodox Christians. The interior minister was a Sunni Muslim who was killed. The vice president is a Sunni Muslim. The speaker of parliament is a Sunni Muslim. So I don't think it's accurate to say that you have Alawites on one side and Sunnis on the other.
Well, Andrew Tabler, all of a sudden what seemed to be a black and white issue gets very, very complex when one starts looking at it. Your view on this, on actually the nature of the Syrian society and whether a full understanding of its nature will actually help people reach some kind of way to find a solution more easily.
Well, it certainly helps. In this case, when we're talking about the current struggle, it's important to look how the regime was constructed originally by Hafiz al-Assad, Bashar al-Assad's father, and how he stabilized the country. Remember, Syria was once one of the world's most unstable political entities. The way Hafiz al-Assad constructed it was by forming a core of officials, large swaths of whom were Alawites, in key positions such as heading security, the different security services, and different parts of the military, even divisions in the military or in the government, which are headed by a Sunni. Oftentimes the deputy will be an Alawite and will be just as powerful and can actually override that official. But it's true. The way that was constructed, it involves placing a number of Sunnis on the periphery of this core, and co-opting them into the system. Now, the bad news for the Assad regime is after 2 years of bloodletting and trying to pound the opposition into submission, and they are going up the escalation chain. Over 125 Scud missiles have been fired on their own population. The only place that's happened is in Afghanistan after the Soviets pulled out on this scale. So what's happening now is those Sunnis who are in and around the government are now coming to neighboring countries and saying, we're ready to cut loose with the Assad regime, but we're looking for a way out, and that's the real problem. You have fear on the one side, keeping people around this regime, and then on the other side, you have just the lack of a place to go. And this is where the opposition needs to do a lot of work. They need to do.
Well, if I may just pick up at this particular point, apologies for interrupting, Andrew, but I want to go to Ziad Majed with the question about the opposition. We've heard that yes, the scale has been upped by the regime. But at the same time, it does appear increasingly that the opposition itself is becoming increasingly fragmented, not only among those many elements that make up the FSA, for example, but also among those outside fighters who are coming in, those groups who self-describe themselves as Sunni militant, friction between not just religious grounds, but also friction between insiders and outsiders. All these things compounding the problem of an opposition, which after over a year and a half still appears unable to crack that kernel of the Assad regime.
Well, first, I never said that the regime is Alawite and the opposition is Sunni. I said we cannot deny that there is a majority of Sunni on the opposition side and a majority of Alawites on the regime side. And I mentioned the issue of social classes, regional diversity and rural-urban in order not to keep the configuration as only a sectarian one. As for your question, what I would like to say is that the opposition, yes, it is a fragmented opposition. For 43 years, there were no possibilities of having political parties and political diversity in Syria. So now they are discovering politics. They are experiencing the political problems and questions and difficulties. They're not capable so far of elaborating one clear political agenda, not only because there is Islamist and secular, leftist and right-wing, or because they represent all the complexities of the Syrian society, but also because with time the foreign actors became very much influential on the opposition side, like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey and others, exactly as much as Russia and Iran are influential on the regime side. And this is not allowing them, probably due to competing sometimes or conflicting agendas, to unify and to present a better alternative for the despotic regime. As for the external elements who are getting inside the Syrian territories, this is a problem definitely, and I think neighboring countries should be more cautious about it. But this is once again because there is a feeling that the Syrian revolution has been abandoned politically due to the different complexities of the situation by the international community and to a certain extent by the Arab League. More and more elements are getting inside, and some Syrians would say that at least we have some support through their arrival. This is definitely problematic. It will create problems in the future.
I just want to stop you there, if I may, Ziad Majed. But I want to go to Mahdi Nazemroaya very quickly with a particular thing that we have not talked about. We've talked about possibilities of partition as a consequence, as a defeat in a way of the Assad regime. But is there the possibility perhaps that the Assad regime would want some form of partition, would want some form of, no matter how temporary it is, that may be intent on forming enclaves in which it pens those opposed to it and perhaps even allow them to fight among themselves and then come and reclaim the territory it's given up? Is that fanciful, or is that a possibility within the current situation?
I highly doubt that. The only thing that I would say is that the government has granted more autonomy to the Kurds in the northeast of the country to keep the country united. But I highly doubt that the government in Damascus wants to balkanize the country and create enclaves and to continue the fighting. I think they want to stop the fighting. It's in their interest to negotiate and to have peace, and I don't think they want to continue with fighting. I disagree with Ziad when he talks about the international community and the Arab League. The Arab League, first of all, is a bankrupt organization, morally bankrupt. It's done nothing for Arabs. It's only appeased the United States, and it's been helping. It's given a seat to the opposition. And I want to point out that one of the reasons that the opposition is fragmented is not just because of the diversity of Syria. It's because we're talking about the external opposition. We're not talking about the internal opposition, which is the local committees inside the country who are against foreign intervention.
Oh, well, Andrew Tabler, very briefly, your reaction to what was just said there. We're talking about opposition inside. There we got the separation out from the opposition outside as well. Divisions everywhere.
The opposition outside is divided according to their international patrons in some cases. And in some cases, it's just driven by ego, I think. And that's been going on for some time. That's nothing new to the Syrian opposition. It was there when I covered them even before the uprising. Inside the country, I think that we have between localized battalions and the more franchised battalions, whether they're nationalist or Islamist, and those are also backed up by different patrons from the outside. But I think that an opposition, after it's been brutalized like this by such a regime for so long, it's very natural for them to be divided. Now, the elites within the opposition are going to have to come together, consolidate their position, and then really push for their political and military agenda. And if they do that, I think they'll succeed. If not, then I'm afraid without an external intervention, we're going to have this grinder conflict that could possibly divide the country.
Well, at that note, it brings us to the end of the discussion. Thanks to my guests in Washington, D.C., Andrew Tabler, in Paris, Ziad Majed, and in Ottawa, Mahdi Darius Nazemroaya. And thank you for joining us. Remember, Al Jazeera has extensive coverage of what's going on in Syria, not just on this program, but with our news programs and online at aljazeera.com. I'm Hanna. Thanks for joining us.